At last, we have arrived at the epic conclusion of The Lord of the Rings. And whoa, there is a lot to unpack in this movie. From messianic symbolism to the Witch King of Angmar, this story is filled with nuggets of wisdom. Not to mention some badass scenes and speeches that'll make you want to jump up off your couch and slay a dragon. The movie opens with the cautionary tale of Smeagol and Deagol, giving us the much requested backstory of how Gollum came to find the ring and eventually became what he is at the time of the main story. As it goes, his brother Deagol finds it after being pulled into the river by a fish. Don't ask. And Smeagol takes one look at the ring and kills his brother so that he can has it for himself. This scene is especially strong in identifying the power of the ring to manipulate others, and the power it especially has over the weak-minded in order to really grasp the darkness of the ring. Once Smeagol puts it on, everything changes. He describes that he was cursed, his people abandoned him, and he retreated into the mountains in solitude to transform into a monster. His tragic account of this transformation is made even more intense by focusing on his forgetting of nature, as he tells us that we forgot the taste of bread and the sound of trees, the softness of the wind, and in time, we even forgot our own name. He forgets all of the things that make life beautiful, completely disconnected from his soul. Soon, we're back with Frodo and Sam, and it seems that the closer they get to Mount Doom, the heavier the ring becomes. Sam remarks that they must have slept in since it's starting to get dark, but Frodo points out that it's only midday and that the days are just getting darker. Besides being just literal, it also seems to be an allusion to Sauron's power, and by extent, the darkness, which is growing and spreading across the world. We may also do well to remember that it is often darkest just before the dawn, and that this darkness is signaling the final battle. The use of weather itself is actually quite strong in the movies. Remember during Helm's Deep, when Gandalf brought a new rising sun with him that blinded the orcs? It would seem as though dark clouds have a similar energy in Mordor. Just as Gandalf brings the light, Sauron doesn't just represent darkness. He is darkness, he brings darkness, and his influence is spreading. Back in Isengard, Merry and Pippin are having a blast and relaxing on a battlefield of dead orcs. Gandalf and company arrive, and a conversation ensues about what to do with Saruman. While Gimli wants to kill him, Gandalf explains that since he has no more power, but plenty of information, he must be kept alive. Gandalf does his best to convert Saruman to the light side of the Force, but to no avail, and Saruman's stubbornness and even his own cruelty eventually does him in. Now, turns out beating the Saruman level boss is actually a good thing because he had one of the best loot drops ever, a Palantir, an ancient elven seeing stone. But oh shucks, it's cursed. And like the ring, it instantly grabs Pippin's attention. He wants it, he does. Now, these Palantir things are actually pretty interesting all on their own. Ignoring the fact that there's a data analyzing company called Palantir Technologies in California, the Palantiri were seeing stones made by the elves to communicate before being given to the Atlanteans, the Numenorians, and eventually finding their way into the Great Towers after the fall. Now, the stones actually could be used to see for miles, or sometimes show the thoughts of their users. Perhaps in the future, we humans could develop something like that. Just imagine 10 generations of internet from now, we just stare into these crystal balls and have all the information and communication just beam to and from our minds. That'd be kind of fun. Anyways, the use of Palantirs in the books go even deeper. Denethor's fear and attachment to his ego that is later seen in Gondor makes much more sense as Tolkien tells us that he secretly had his own Palantir and would use it to gain forbidden knowledge. Denethor thought at first he had the power to stand against Sauron, and for some time he was able to actually mentally withstand that power. But upon seeing the advancements of Sauron's armies in the days before the siege of Gondor, Denethor turned to complete despair and became the guy we see in the movies. Spiritually speaking, this theme of forbidden knowledge is something present in most mythologies, and almost every time, it comes with a price. Knowledge will always be revealed at the perfect time, and searching for it unjustly will cause nothing but danger. There is actually a story from ancient Egypt about the mysterious Book of Thoth, which upon reading it would transform mortals to have the awareness and powers of gods. However, upon doing so, tremendous consequences would befall them because this power has to be earned, not taken by force. Right, sorry, Lord of the Rings. So now we jump to Rohan and everyone is partying it up in the throne room, mourning their dead and feasting. You know, things that probably go pretty well together. And Éowyn gives Aragorn a chalice to drink from. And this is just an almost perfect mirror to not only King Arthur and the Grail, but also the Eucharist ritual celebrated by Christians, further cementing the whole Aragorn Jesus symbolism. I mean, hey, he even looks like our depictions of Christ, though Gandalf really is the one who rocks the white robes, for sure. Now, during the party, Aragorn and Gandalf discuss how Frodo is doing. Aragorn asks Gandalf, "What does your heart tell you?" And now I know this phrase is super common, but it sure does pack weight. Listening to the heart is the way we connect with truth, for it comes from both love and wisdom. In this, Gandalf gives a deep smile as knowing flows through him that Frodo is alive. I think it's also worth mentioning that one of the most profound things you can do for someone is ask them a profound question, demonstrated beautifully by this scene. Back on the not so yellow brick road to Mount Doom, we find our favorite hobbits asleep and Gollum talking to his own reflection. Smee Gollum is discussing plans with himself to kill the hobbits, but Sam overhears and, well, you know, he wasn't exactly a fan of that conversation. What's curious is that Smee Gollum explains Smeagol wouldn't hurt a fly as he kills one accidentally that lands on his head. But really, it's here we have this split personality again, the Jungian shadow self that we explored earlier. The ring has split his psyche in two, and based on the conversations that they have with each other, it seems as though Smeagol and Gollum actually have different memories or thoughts, so divided inside that they actually manifest as two separate personalities in one body. Anyway, that's something that we've already explored, so let's tag in with Arwen for a moment. There's something interesting about her departure from the world, as this scene is very natural, peaceful, yet sad in its tranquility. There's a sense of fleeing from a dying world, but the divine feminine will not let go upon realizing that there is a greater truth that she had not seen before, that while there is death in her future with Aragorn, there is life also. Here we have another message of sacrifice. For staying in these lands, she gives up more of her power, but she has chosen love above all else. In this, she convinces Elrond to reforge the sword of Excalibur. No, sorry, that was a typo. The Master Sword pulled from the stone in Hyrule Forest. Sorry, no, that's not it either. Anduril, that's the one. Now, Anduril isn't any old sword. It's the blade of the true Redeemer King. Anduril means flame of the West in Elvish and is supposed to represent Aragorn's right to rule. It really does seem to have been based off of the mythical Excalibur, as Tolkien tells us that very bright was the sword when it was made whole again. The light of the sun shone readily within it, and the light of the moon shone cold, and its edge was hard and keen. This is actually a direct call back to the King Arthur legend, where when Excalibur was drawn, it was said to shine with the light of 100 suns, so strong that it blinded any enemy who looked at it. Interestingly, when Elrond gives him the sword, he states that the crownless shall be king. Up until this point, Aragorn had still been the ranger, holding on to this lesser perception of himself. Elrond explains that it is now time to switch classes, equip a sword with higher hit points, and step into his birthright as the true king of Gondor. From a philosophical perspective, this speaks volumes to self-authenticity. Too often we pretend to be someone else in our lives, attaching labels to ourselves that define us in our society. But what is being said here is that only by shedding those labels and being true to yourself can you ascend to be the highest form of you. And who knows, that new you might even be a king compared to the old you. Now, Minas Tirith, dang. This is a city that just looks and feels pure, as if you know the good guys live here. Although, at this point in the story, it could use some new management, if you know what I mean. The way it's laid out is reminiscent of geometry, built on 7 levels, each of concentric circles rising higher than the previous one. In a way, it's like a 3D version of Plato's account of Atlantis. At the very top, we see the Citadel, which has a cross in the center leading to the white tree in the middle of a fountain. This layout probably wasn't an accident given how much Tolkien loved the story of Atlantis. Also, it's worth mentioning that if we really wanted to, humans could totally build a city like this today. Sure, it would take some work, but imagine how beautiful it would be. and what kind of things it would inspire within the human consciousness if we were to do so. Up until this point, we haven't yet been properly introduced to Denethor. And when we do, let's just say, probably not what we'd expect from the king of a place like this, but I guess that's why he's just the steward. Perhaps Tolkien is implying that good and evil are kind of subjective, and it's ultimately about personal choice that determines our reality, rather than the positions that we're in. This is reinforced later on when Gandalf explains to Pippin that, well, there was never really much hope, just a fool's hope. It seems like he's placing a bigger emphasis on personal effort than position or fate. Later on, when Pippin lights the beacons, against Denethor's command, I might add, they produce a chain reaction of spreading fire that causes all of the other beacons to be lit, eventually making their way back to Aragorn, who, along with Rohan, begins to ride to Gondor's aid. This scene reminds us of a Buddhist quote that says, "Thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of that candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases from being shared, only expands." In this line of thought, with fire and light representing enlightenment, all it takes is for one beacon to be lit, to start a chain reaction that will eventually allow others to light their own beacons, so to speak, and ultimately bring about the salvation of Gondor. For if Rohan didn't ride, Gondor would have fallen. There might also be a lesson here about being willing to ask for help, even if we're too stubborn to really actually do it. Once again, when the Nazgul begin to attack, Gandalf comes galloping in and shines the light of God in their faces, driving them off. We saw this before, but light has this amazing ability to dispel darkness. And that's not just a metaphor, it's a scientific fact. Speaking of darkness though, we also have a side story that is very important, and the truth that descending into darkness can bring about great revelations, as is the case with the army of the dead. On the surface, it seems as if the evil mountain eventually holds the keys to victory, speaking to the idea that in order to illuminate the darkness within, we must descend into the darkness in order to come out on the other side. Now, this army of the dead is a whole video on its own, but to go into it a little bit, the men of the mountain were cursed by Isildur when they agreed to help him fight Sauron, only to desert him in his hour of need. And so they were banished to the mountain until the next true king could release them. The whole aspect of the story is a part of Aragorn's hero's journey, in that he basically goes into an underworld type place, the realm of the dead. When they get to the door, it is naturally shut off because the place is only meant for the dead, not the living, leading to a funny exchange between Legolas and Gimli that it's unheard of. An elf running underground and a dwarf dare not? Again, this reminds us of the ideas of labels from earlier, and how it's almost a complete role reversal, speaking to how our true natures can shine through once we stop assigning ourselves to certain traits or groups. And so when we first meet the dead, they are terrifying, as they probably ought to be. Yet they seem to have created a very nice little city structure down under the mountain, with cool glowing staircases and skulls everywhere. The Wraith King points out at one point that only the true king can redeem them and thus command them. And Aragorn then shows his rightful position by grabbing the king, being the only one who can touch the dead, and showing him Anduril, confirming his kingship. All this talk of redemption should sound familiar, as it's a key part that signifies Aragorn as a Christ-like figure. The undead army are symbolic of the damned, sinners in a way, and only the King of Kings can redeem them. This section is strongly inspired by messianic mythology, indicating that even the damned can be redeemed by the grace of the noble, if they are willing to serve. Back at the battle, Denethor has resolved to burn himself and his son on a pyre. And, oh my god, you are so dumb! I'm sorry. Faramir is just so obviously alive, and Denethor honestly could probably have noticed, except his ego seemed to have drowned in a combination of sadness of loss and disgust that Faramir is not Boromir. It's kind of weird. Thank heavens for Pippin and Gandalf, who rush in to save the day. Gandalf gives Denethor the old 1-2, and Denethor eventually realizes that his son is still alive. Illuminated by this valiant truth, Denethor is so excited that he screams in fiery, bloody murder and runs to his death. And nobody cares, because they're all fighting a much bigger war. And the way that this is shown is actually kind of funny, because as we zoom out, we see Denethor fall off the top of the city, and it just keeps zooming out to see the totality of the battle. and it really just shows how petty his own ego was in the face of all that they were battling against. And speaking of that battle, isn't it curious that the orcs demonstrably feel fear as well? When the soldiers of Gondor begin to fight back and launch their own catapults, we see the orcs visibly afraid. It's as if to remind us that fear too is a universal trait, one that isn't unique to only one side of the warring spectrum. Meanwhile, in the traveling tribe of short people, Gollum has deceived Frodo into telling Sam to go home. And as he's climbing down the mountain, Sam happens to come across tricksy business. And Frodo and Gollum at the top of the mountain make their way into Shelob's cave for tea and crumpets. I mean, death, imminent death. Yes, that. Fortunately, Frodo is armed with the pure light of Lothlorien. And after Gollum seemingly falls to his death, Frodo makes use of this gift, the elven starlight, lighting the darkness around him. This light seems to drive Shelob away, almost as if she just can't even get close to it, which might be due to it being a pure elvish tool, or like how purity repels chaos, as we saw with Gollum earlier. Shelob herself is a very interesting discussion because of what spiders represent. For humans in the world today, fear of spiders, arachnophobia, is one of the most common fears in the world. It is very interesting. Why are we so afraid of these little spiders? Is it because they are some of the fiercest predators of the insect kingdom? Perhaps their ability to produce beautiful yet terrifying webs scare us for some reason. Or is there a mystery hidden in our ancient past that has left the fear of spiders locked in our DNA as a species? Whatever the reason, a giant spider was the perfect fit for Shelob, as our human consciousness today instantly associates it with a dark or sinister force. And that is reinforced very well by Shelob. Yet at the same time, we might just be invited to use this opportunity to reflect on our own arachnophobia if we have any. When we see a little spider, especially, not a giant poisonous one, which is a little less common in the world, and we have a fear response, let's ask ourselves, I'm 1,000 times larger than you and you pose no threat to me. Why am I afraid? And just see what your mind comes up with in response. Anyways, back at the battle, Pippin and Gandalf at one point are faced with a giant army of orcs. And in his terror, Pippin asks the wizard if it's the end. And in true mystic wisdom fashion, Gandalf once again delivers a powerful speech that echoes the words of the Hermetica. End? Oh, the journey doesn't end here. Death is simply another path, one that we all must take. Everything rolls back and turns to silver clouds, and then you see it. White shores and beyond, a far green country moving into a swift sunrise. A description of paradise seemingly mirroring that of the Christian heaven. But the idea of seeing death as simply another part in the journey is incredibly important in any ascension process. In usual fashion, Gandalf helps to ease fear, but in this sense, it isn't a physical fear in the moment, but the biggest fear of all, the fear of death. Pippin remarks that, it doesn't sound so bad actually, arguably echoing all of our collective thoughts when thinking about transitioning from this life if we look at it from this inherently spiritual perspective. We also here cannot understate the importance of Éowyn and her killing of the Witch King. Now the Witch King himself actually seems to be a little bit like an evil Jesus character, What with his own crown of metal barbed thorns? He himself has a sort of evil blessing curse upon him too. No man can kill him. Yet Éowyn in the midst of battle reveals that she is no man and blows his mind with a sword to the face. Herein we find a subtle reference to the power of the divine feminine and the fall of the patriarchal energy in the world at the hands of the noble woman. Finally, Aragorn's arrival scene is interesting as he arrives in one of the orc boats that was supposed to bring reinforcements. Naturally, the orcs think that they are allies until Aragorn reveals himself. Thinking someone is something else because of an outwardly appearance, does that sound familiar? This scene similarly mirrors exactly what happens in the Two Towers, where Gandalf the White first revealed himself to the Fellowship and appeared a little bit like Sauron. What's more, we find that the battle is just over the moment they arrive. These dead warriors cannot be beat. They instantly take down the enemy and the battle is won. There must here be some wisdom in the sense that drawing upon forces outside of the physical dimension, we can accomplish great things a bajillion times easier than if we try and brute force our way through the challenge. As the hobbits get closer to Mount Doom, seeing the garrison makes Frodo lose hope. but Sam reminds him to simply make it to the bottom of the hill first. It's a kind of the journey begins with a single step mentality. Something may seem daunting at first, but breaking it down into steps and completing each one is all that's required. It doesn't matter really, getting to Mordor or spiritual enlightenment, both are a step-by-step process, and one that must be approached with patience. Once the hobbits reach the threshold, however, Gandalf loses all sense of them, which prompts an incredibly reflective scene. Gandalf actually appears afraid for a moment, stating that he has sent the hobbits to their death. And actually, he too seems to lose hope. Now, up until this point, it has been Gandalf who rekindles the hope when it is lost. And this scene begs the question, what happens when the main support guy needs support himself? It's actually Aragorn who comes up with the plan to march upon the Black Gate and distract Sauron, even though Gandalf doesn't think it'll work. It's like sometimes even the best of us are still human and subject to fear. Even those who are on the path of enlightenment doubt themselves. As the forces of good march upon the Black Gate, we enter the final chapter of the story. At the entrance of Mount Doom, we see a struggling Frodo, weighed heavily by the ring, unable to continue. Sam tries to rekindle his spirit by reminding him of the beautiful natural imagery of the Shire. Yet, at this point, Frodo is so exhausted that he can't even remember the good things in life and sees only darkness. At this, the end of the journey, Frodo has lost hope, and without Sam to prop him up and aid him, as is true many times, he would have failed. This is very important because generally in Lord of the Rings, Frodo is glorified, and Samwise is often considered the comic relief, or as Gollum puts it, the stupid fat hobbit. We even see this in pop culture today. For example, there's an episode of The Big Bang Theory where everyone's fighting over who gets to dress up as Frodo for a costume party. But Sam? Psh, nobody wants to be Sam. Yet, Sam is one of the most important heroes of the story. Of course, Frodo had to be the one to carry the ring, but by the end, he was mostly an empty shell, his spirit completely worn away by the evil of the ring. It's because of Samwise that Frodo was able to make it at all, and he deserves just all of the medals for such courage and bravery. But now, don't get me wrong, I'm not understating the importance of Frodo here. There is some especially strong messianic symbolism here that simply cannot be ignored. Much like Jesus carrying his cross for the sins of mankind, Frodo carries a burden of evil on behalf of the whole world. He literally walks his own Via Dolorosa to Mount Doom, just like Jesus making his way to Golgotha. And as he approaches the cracks of doom, the ring becomes a crushing weight, just as the cross was for Jesus. Sam, who carried Frodo up to Mount Doom, parallels Simon of Cyrene, who helps Jesus by carrying his cross too. Once making it up Mount Doom, overlooking the fiery lava below, and overpowered by the might of Sauron, Frodo's own spirit gives in completely, and he declares that he will keep the ring. At long last, the crushing burden that he bore has broken him, and all of the darkness within has taken over. Parallels have been made here to Jesus' time in the desert, where he was tempted by the devil. And speak of the devil, oh look, it's Gollum. Isn't it so interesting that Gollum, in his final moments, returns just in time to become the tragic hero, leading to the destruction of the ring? This also fulfills the ideas of Gandalf from long ago, that Gollum still has a part to play in this story, a very important part. Could you imagine if he wasn't there? It probably wouldn't have ended well for anyone without Gollum. Gollum the Brave. Further, it's also no accident that the ring can only be destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom where it was created. It's as if to say that darkness can only truly be destroyed at its source. What's more, after the ring is gone, Frodo's spirit returns, and he once again can see the natural imagery that Sam described of the Shire. So of course, they're picked up by eagles and whisked away home. And after waking up back in Rivendell, Frodo is reunited with the Fellowship and his old friends, and the general energy and tone is, well, as expected, quite cheerful. The darkness has been destroyed, and a new age is beginning. Aragorn is crowned the rightful king, and we have this incredibly touching moment where everyone bows to the king, but the king stops and says, "My friends, you bow to no one." Think about this for a moment. The king bows to the hobbits. This is such a powerful scene, demonstrating humility, respect, and honor to those who have sacrificed more than anyone in the entire story. How can we relate to this in our own lives? Who do we know in our lives who have made incredible sacrifices? Who can we show our respect and honor to by honoring them for their service to the greater good? As their time in the East comes to an end, the Hobbits return to the Shire. We see a funny little scene where Sam resolves to ask out his crush Rosie after a few drinks, signifying that even after all of the questing, all of the darkness and epic battles that happened, love still prevails. There's actually a classic archetype about the sacred wedding in the completion of a story, and Lord of the Rings hits it perfectly, not just once, but twice, both with Aragorn and Arwen and Sam and Rosie. Yet, something stirs in the heart of the Shire. Frodo shares a feeling relatable to anyone who has been or is currently going through an awakening process. He asks, how do you pick up the threads of an old life? How do you go on when in your heart you begin to understand there is no going back? This arguably is one of the hardest parts of experiencing a spiritual or transcendent awakening. Once you begin to see the world in a different way, from an inherently spiritual perspective, you will never want to return to old paradigms or ways of thinking. Your old life and paradigms will often be changed and stretched so dramatically that it feels as if your world may be falling apart. Yet, the overriding message is that if we stick with this inner transformation, it will lead to amazing things. While growth can sometimes be painful, it will always lead to something better. Like how strange a caterpillar must feel inside the cocoon, mixing up its genetics and everything. But boy, is flying awesome once the transformation is complete. When Frodo accomplishes his mission, like Jesus, he says, "It is done." Just as Christ ascending to heaven, Frodo's life in Middle-earth comes to an end when he departs to the undying lands of the elves, a place where only the purest of heart may go. Frodo, Bilbo, and Gandalf depart into the West, and this is truly symbolic of the final ascension of the soul. Upon finding completion, they move from one world into another, a greater kingdom beyond the borders of their own world. It is a majestic ending and could not be more perfect, topped with a cherry at the end with a scene of Sam returning home and finding his child and wife waiting for him. A beautiful scene showing the cyclical nature of the world order and the transition into a new life. To us, the hidden spirituality of Lord of the Rings is not so much hidden, but rather is woven into the story in such a way that it expresses philosophies, mystic ideas, and wisdom in ways that illuminates our consciousness about concepts such as good, evil, and the ascension process. I trust that throughout this exploration, we too have helped to shine deeper light for all of us the next time we go to enjoy this story. With that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon on the next episode of Spirit Science.